The first indication that something was wrong wasn't the man standing outside. It was Lillian's dress. She hadn't dressed up for me in ages, and that fact struck me immediately. The deep red fabric hugged her frame with an intentional elegance, her makeup appeared almost too flawless, and she carried herself with a vibrancy I hadn't seen in years. She was glowing, but I knew I wasn't the reason. I sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly pushing my fork around my plate as she walked past without so much as a glance in my direction. She reached for her coat with a quiet urgency, as if she had somewhere more important to be. "Where are you going?" I asked, setting my fork down. Lillian hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coat rack. "Out," she responded simply. That single word carried more weight than anything she had said to me in months. "With who?" I pressed. She let out a sigh before finally turning to face me as if my questions were nothing more than an inconvenience. "His name is Derek." I frowned. "I don't know any Derek." "You don't need to," she said, slipping her arms into her coat. A slow, uneasy sensation crept up my spine. "Lillian," I said carefully, "are you seriously telling me you're going on a date?" She rolled her eyes as if I was being unreasonable. "Don't be ridiculous." But then she reached for her purse. And that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside. My chair scraped loudly against the floor as I stood abruptly. Moving toward the window, I pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. And there he was. A man I had never seen before stood at the edge of our driveway, hands casually tucked into his pockets, a confident smirk resting on his face. He wasn't just arriving, he was waiting for her. Something twisted in my gut. "Lillian," I said again, my voice lower this time. She exhaled sharply, already exhausted by me. "I told you, I'm going out." I turned back to her. "With him?" She met my gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The bluntness of her answer hit me like a punch to the chest. I searched her face for any sign of doubt, guilt, or even hesitation, anything that suggested she wasn't fully committed to this choice. But there was nothing. Just mild annoyance, like I was delaying something inevitable. "Are you serious?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. Lillian sighed again, rubbing her temple. "Look, Brendan, I didn't want to have this conversation tonight. I was hoping you'd be mature enough to handle it." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Handle what?" "This," she said, gesturing vaguely between us. "The fact that I need more than this." She said it so plainly, as if our life together, our marriage, wasn't enough for her anymore. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You're cheating on me." "Don't be so dramatic," she replied. "Then what would you call it?" Lillian grabbed her purse, smoothing down her dress with a practiced motion. "Exploring my options." Her words struck me like a slap. "Exploring your—" I cut myself off, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "You're my wife, Lillian." "For now," she said, checking her phone. And that was it. The moment I realized I had already lost her. Lillian had let go of our marriage long before this conversation. I was just the last to notice. She moved toward the door, but I stepped in front of it. "Move," she said, her tone flat. "No," I said firmly. She arched a brow. "I wasn't asking." "You can't just—" I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "Do you even hear yourself? You're walking out of our home, to his car, like this is normal." Lillian folded her arms across her chest. "It's normal for people who aren't stuck in the past." I clenched my jaw. "You're my wife." She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Maybe. But tonight I'm his." And with that, she stepped past me, opened the door, and walked straight into another man's waiting arms. I stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the frame, watching as my wife slipped into his car without a second glance. And that's when it hit me, I wasn't losing her. I had already lost her. The house felt empty without her. As the car disappeared down the street, I remained standing in the doorway, fingers gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. The cold night air seeped in, wrapping around me, but I barely registered it. My mind was spinning, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to anger. Slowly, I closed the door, as if shutting it could somehow contain the wreckage she had left behind. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that this wasn't real, that she would come back and say it was all some kind of twisted joke, I knew better. Lillian was gone, and she wasn't looking back. I paced the length of the living room, my thoughts racing with questions I couldn't answer. Had she been planning this for weeks? Months? How long had she been slipping away? Making excuses, treating me like a fool in a game she thought she had already won. My phone rested on the coffee table. I picked it up, hesitating before opening our messages. There was nothing there to suggest this was coming. No confessions, no warnings. Just the usual, everyday exchanges between a husband and wife. Me. "Hey, don't forget to pick up the dry cleaning on your way home." Lillian, got it. What do you want for dinner tonight? I asked, hoping for a simple answer. I'm not hungry, Lillian replied, her voice distracted. Late meeting, late meeting. I should have caught it then. The way she repeated herself, the way her voice seemed distant. But I didn't. Instead, I tightened my grip around the phone, my pulse pounding against my ribs as a creeping unease settled in my chest. Was this really the first time? Or had she been walking out that door for longer than I had realized while I sat here, oblivious, wrapped in the comfort of denial? The thought burned inside me, bitter and sharp. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to move. Grabbing my keys and jacket, I stepped outside, unsure of where I was going. Only certain that staying in that house, pretending nothing was wrong, was impossible. My car roared to life, the engine's hum cutting through the quiet of the empty driveway. As I backed out, my eyes drifted to the spot where Adrian's car had been earlier. Though it was gone, its presence lingered in my mind like a specter, taunting me. I drove aimlessly, hands clenching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was no destination, only the need to escape. But my thoughts refused to let me. The image of Lillian smiling at him, touching him, looking at him the way she once looked at me, sent a wave of nausea through me. I needed to see it for myself. The realization struck me hard. I couldn't just sit back and wonder. I had to know. Opening the tracking app on my phone, I stared at the blinking dot marking her location. A restaurant. A nice one. The kind we hadn't visited in years. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. She had told me we needed to cut back to save money, that home-cooked meals were better. And yet, here she was, sipping overpriced wine under dim lighting with him. I should have turned around. Let her make her choice. Let her believe I was too broken to react. But I couldn't. 15 minutes later, I was parked across the street from the restaurant. Through the large windows, I saw them. Lillian sat across from Adrian, her chin resting on her hand, her gaze locked onto his like he was the most fascinating person in the world. She was smiling, laughing, even a sound I hadn't heard in months. In that moment, it felt as if I had already been erased from her life, like she was just waiting for the formalities to make it official. My hands curled into fists. This wasn't just dinner. This wasn't casual. This was a declaration. I should have left. I should have turned the key in the ignition, driven back home, and let her chase whatever illusion she was after. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, gripping the steering wheel, watching through the rain-speckled windshield as my wife, smiled at another man like I had never existed. It wasn't the kind of smile you give a friend or a casual acquaintance. No, this was something deeper, intimate, familiar. The way she leaned in, the way she let him tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It made my stomach twist. That used to be me. That used to be my place. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, my breath uneven. But I wasn't angry, not in the way I expected to be. I felt detached, like I was watching someone else's life unfold before me, already knowing the ending. She had made her choice. But did she really think I would just sit back and let her? I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hands. If I walked inside, what would I even say? That I had caught her? That I had proof of what she hadn't even bothered to hide? No, that wasn't why I was here. I needed to see it, fully, undeniably, with my own eyes. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open my car door and stepped into the cold night air. A part of me hoped she would notice me, that our eyes would meet through the window, that there would be some flicker of guilt, some recognition that I still existed, that I wasn't just a shadow in the life she had already moved on from. But she never looked. Not once. I walked toward the restaurant entrance, keeping my steps measured, controlled. I wasn't here to interrupt. I was here to observe, to see just how far she would go when she believed no one was watching. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of seared steak and expensive wine. The low hum of conversation mingled with soft jazz playing overhead. I kept to the shadows, slipping into an empty bar seat that gave me a clear view of their table without drawing attention to myself. Lillian was animated, her hands moving as she spoke, her expression alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. Adrian was watching her intently, his smile just the right mix of understanding and charm, leaning in slightly, just enough to make it clear he knew exactly what he was doing. And then I saw it. His hand resting on her knee. She didn't pull away. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she placed her own hand over his, her fingers threading between his like it was the most natural thing in the world. I swallowed hard. This was it. The confirmation I had been waiting for. The moment I could no longer lie to myself. My wife hadn't just been considering her options, she had already made her choice. She was gone. The bartender approached, offering a drink, but I dismissed him with a wave of my hand. My thoughts were too tangled, my focus entirely on the scene playing out in front of me. What was I supposed to do? Cause a scene? Confront her in front of an audience? What would that even accomplish? I wanted her to feel something, to realize the weight of her actions. But she wasn't hesitating. She wasn't nervous. She was laughing. And not the kind of laugh that masked guilt or discomfort. It was real, genuine, the kind of joy I hadn't seen from her in years. And suddenly, I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that she was betraying me or the fact that she looked happy doing it. I remained in my seat for another 10 minutes, watching a version of my wife I no longer recognized, a version that no longer belonged to me. And before I could fully process my actions, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I reached for my phone and took a picture of them, of their hands intertwined, of the way she smiled at him. Evidence. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it yet, but one thing was clear, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The drive home was silent. But not the kind of silence that soothes, it was suffocating, pressing down on me, seeping into every thought like a parasite. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning pale, though I barely noticed. The only thing I could see was the image burned into my mind, Lillian, laughing, leaning into him, her fingers resting against his as though she had never belonged to me at all. I should have been furious. I should have felt my chest burning with rage, should have shouted, broken things, demanded explanations, even if I already knew they would mean nothing. But I wasn't angry. I was empty. For years I had been holding on to a version of Lillian that no longer existed. The woman who once chose me, who had built a life by my side. I had convinced myself she was still in there somewhere, that if I just tried harder, if I became more of what she needed, she would return to me. But tonight, parked outside that restaurant, I finally saw the truth. She was never coming back. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt unfamiliar, like a place where someone else had lived, where memories had once been carved into the walls but had long since faded. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me, and for the first time, I truly understood the depth of loneliness. Her perfume still lingered in the air, faint yet unmistakable. The rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock felt deafening in the quiet. I walked into the kitchen, half expecting to see her there, maybe pouring a glass of wine or preparing something to eat. But it was empty. Just like the rest of the house. I sat at the dining table, staring at nothing, my mind replaying the night's events in perfect detail. The way she had walked past me without a second thought. The way she had touched him so effortlessly. The way she had given him the pieces of herself she had withheld from me. Almost without realizing it, I pulled out my phone. The photo was still there, a single frame capturing the exact moment my marriage shattered. Her fingers entwined with his. Her lips forming a smile meant for someone else. A snapshot of a future she had already begun, one that no longer included me. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I could delete it. Pretend I never saw it. Try to sleep and wake up the next morning as if nothing had changed. But it had. And no amount of denial would make it go away. Without thinking, I opened our text messages. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, my mind tangled in 1,000 unanswered questions. What was I even supposed to say? That I knew? That I had watched her throw away everything we had built as if it meant nothing? Then, before I could stop myself, I typed. I hope he was worth it. I stared at the words for a long time before taking a slow breath and hitting send. The message went through instantly. No read receipt. No response. Just silence. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face, exhaling slowly. Maybe she wouldn't reply. Maybe she would glance at it, dismiss it, and return to the life she had chosen. Or maybe, just maybe, she would feel something. But at this point, I wasn't even sure what I wanted. An apology? A reason? Some form of justice? None of it would change the fact that she had left me long before tonight. Exhaustion settled over me as I stood up and made my way to the bedroom. It still smelled like her. The sheets, the pillows, everything carried traces of her presence. I climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep would not come. And then, just as I began to drift into the restless fog of my thoughts, my phone buzzed. A single message from Lillian. "You don't understand." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening, my mind racing with possibilities. Before I could even type out a reply, another message appeared on my screen. "We need to talk." I didn't sleep at all that night. How could I? Every time I shut my eyes, all I saw was her, not the woman I had once loved, but the one I had watched from across the restaurant, looking at another man like I had never even existed. I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, my mind consumed by a whirlwind of questions I wasn't even sure I wanted answered. Her message sat there on my phone, a silent, ticking time bomb. "You don't understand." Understand what? That she had emotionally left our marriage long before I even realized it? That I was nothing more than a lingering shadow of her past while she moved forward, carving out a future with someone else? I had spent years trying to understand her, meeting her halfway, being the husband she needed me to be. But in the end, none of it had mattered. Not long after, another message arrived. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. Not right away. Let her wonder for once. Let her sit in the silence, left alone with her own decisions. Maybe she assumed I would beg, plead with her to come back, to play the weak, predictable role she had grown weary of. But I wasn't going to be that man anymore. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. My body ached, my head throbbed, and my chest felt like an empty, hollow space. The house around me didn't feel like home anymore. Every room carried remnants of her scent still lingered in the air, her hairbrush rested untouched on the bathroom counter, and the half-empty coffee mug she had left in the sink remained as if she had never truly left. I moved through the house in a fog, making a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking, staring blankly at my phone without really seeing it. Then, at exactly 8:32 in the morning, she called. I ignored it. She called again. And again. By the fourth call, something inside me snapped. I answered, my voice rough with exhaustion. "What?" For a brief moment, silence. Maybe she hadn't expected me to pick up. Maybe she had rehearsed some well-crafted voicemail, believing she'd have time to prepare her words. Then she exhaled a slow, unsteady breath. "Brendan." Hearing her say my name sent a strange sensation through me. It felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone else, like I was no longer the man she used to say it to with love. "You what?" My voice was devoid of emotion. She hesitated. "Can we meet?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Meet? Like we were nothing more than business partners trying to resolve a dispute. As if last night had never happened. As if she hadn't walked out of our home and into another man's arms without a second thought. "No," I said flatly. "Brendan, you wanted this." "Lillian, don't act surprised now." Her breath hitched. "You don't even know the full story." I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against the bridge of my nose. "The full story?" My voice was edged with bitterness. "You mean the part where you held his hand? Or the part where you laughed like you were on the best date of your life?" Silence. I let it stretch, let her sit with it, feel the weight of it. Finally, she spoke. "It's not what you think." A dry, humorless chuckle escaped me. "Oh, that's an original one." "Please," she whispered. "Just meet me." I should have refused. I should have told her to deal with whatever mess she had created on her own. But some part of me, the part that still wanted answers, that hadn't fully let go, responded instead. "Fine," I muttered. 1 hour. Our usual spot. I ended the call before she could say anything else. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. It was one of those places we used to visit back when everything was simpler, before life had become so tangled and unrecognizable. The memory left a bitter taste in my mouth. Lillian was already there, sitting by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. When she saw me, her expression shifted, something close to relief flickered across her face. But I didn't return it. I took the seat across from her, arms crossed, waiting. She studied me for a long moment, as if searching for something in my expression. "You look exhausted." I let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah, well, finding out your wife has a boyfriend will do that to you." She flinched, lowering her gaze to the coffee cup in front of her. "It's not like that," I scoffed. "Then tell me, Lillian, what is it like?" She swallowed hard. "I didn't plan for this to happen." "Oh, well, that makes it so much better," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. Her eyes snapped up, frustration flashing in them. "Can you just let me explain?" I leaned back, arms still folded. "Go ahead. Explain." She took a deep breath, bracing herself. "Adrian is different. He makes me feel alive again." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "And I don't." She winced. "It's not that simple." "To me, it is." she exhaled, shaking her head. I felt lost for a long time, Brendan, and I tried to ignore it. I really did. But something was missing. And when I met Adrian, I lifted a hand, cutting her off. Stop. Just stop. Because I didn't need to hear this. I didn't need to sit across from the woman I had given everything to and listen to her tell me I wasn't enough. Why are we even here, Lillian? My voice was suddenly heavy with exhaustion. What do you want from me? She hesitated. I don't know. A dry, bitter laugh escaped me. Wow, that's really something. She faltered. I don't want to lose you completely. The words stopped me cold. The sheer nerve of it left me breathless. You don't want to lose me? I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper, laced with something dangerously close to disbelief. Lillian, I said, meeting her eyes, my tone unwavering. You lost me the moment you got into his car. For a second, she looked like she wanted to fight back, to come up with some excuse that would make this moment easier, at least for her. But she didn't, because deep down, she knew the truth just as well as I did. I pushed back my chair and stood up, the scrape of wood against the floor the only sound between us. I hope he makes you happy. Brendan, she started. But I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked out. For the first time in years, I didn't turn back. I didn't chase after her. And for the first time in years, I realized I didn't need to. Outside, the air felt different. Heavier, maybe, or lighter. I wasn't sure. Maybe it was the weight of everything that had just unraveled between us. Or maybe it was the quiet, creeping realization that I was finally seeing Lillian for who she really was. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the cafe window. Through the glass, I could see her still sitting inside, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she never even sipped from. She looked unfamiliar, a stranger in the same skin as the woman I had once loved. For years, I had been clinging to a version of her that no longer existed. The woman who used to laugh at my dumb jokes, who used to reach for my hand just because she wanted to, who used to look at me like I was the only person in the world. She was gone. I had been holding on to a ghost, convincing myself that if I just tried hard enough, if I just loved her enough, I could bring her back. But ghosts don't come back. And Lillian? She had disappeared long before she ever walked out that door. I didn't go home right away. Couldn't. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum, a relic of a life that had already ended. So instead I drove. No destination, no plan. Just the steady hum of the engine and the blur of streetlights flickering past. I thought about all the signs I had ignored. The late nights, the business trips, the way she had quietly withdrawn, pulling away without ever needing to say a word. Had she ever really loved me? Or had I just been convenient? The question gnawed at me, though deep down, I already knew the answer. At some point, I found myself parked outside Wesley's place. My best friend. The guy who always had an answer for everything, whether I wanted to hear it or not. I knocked twice, and a few moments later, the door swung open. Wesley blinked at me, like he wasn't sure if I was really standing there. Brendan. Yeah. My voice came out rough, like I hadn't spoken in hours. His eyes flicked over my face, taking in whatever mess he saw there. Then, without another word, he stepped aside. Come in. The familiar scent of beer and takeout hit me the second I walked in. His apartment was the same as always, comfortable, a little chaotic, the kind of place where nothing was out of place because everything was. Wesley shut the door behind me, arms crossing over his chest. You look like hell. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I feel worse. He studied me for a moment before nodding toward the couch. Sit. Talk. I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair. She's been cheating. Wesley didn't react, not even a flicker of surprise. Yeah, he said simply. I figured. My head snapped up. What? He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't have proof, man, but I saw things. The way she acted, the way she treated you. She was never really there. It was like she was just waiting for an excuse to leave. A slow, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. And you didn't tell me? He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Would you have believed me? I opened my mouth, ready to argue. But then, I stopped, because he was right. I had spent so much time making excuses for her, convincing myself that if I just gave her space, if I just held on a little longer, things would go back to the way they used to be. But they never would. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. She wanted to meet up, said I didn't understand. Wesley scoffed. Yeah? Understand what? That she's selfish. I shook my head. She said she doesn't want to lose me completely. He stared at me, then without a word, reached for the beer on the table, took a long sip, and finally said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." I let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Yeah, pretty much. Wesley leaned back against the armrest, shaking his head. She walks out, cheats on you, rubs it in your face, and now she doesn't want to lose you? He scoffed again. Brendan, that's not love. That's control. She wants to keep you around, just in case. Like a backup plan. I knew that. Deep down, I had always known it. But hearing it said out loud made it real in a way I hadn't been ready to face. Wesley watched me for a moment, then asked, "So what are you gonna do?" I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Here's an idea. Don't give her what she wants." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You said she wants to keep you in her life, right? Keep you as the safety net." He gestured vaguely. "Don't let her. Cut her off. Take your life back." Wesley leaned back, shaking his head. "Might as well change the locks while you're at it." I ran a hand down my face, exhaling heavily. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is." His gaze was sharp. "Do you think she hesitated before betraying you? Do you think she sat there, torn apart over whether it was the right thing to do? No. She made her choice without a second thought. Now it's your turn to make yours." For the first time in what felt like ages, maybe even longer than that, I let myself entertain the idea. What if I simply stopped caring? What if I quit waiting for her to decide what she wanted and, instead, chose for myself? I had spent so much time fighting for something that only one of us had been holding on to. Maybe it was time to stop. I pushed myself up from my seat. "I need to go home." Wesley raised an eyebrow. "You good?" "Not yet." I grabbed my keys, rolling them between my fingers. "But I will be." As I drove, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to plead. I wasn't going to run after her, hoping she would change her mind. Lillian had made her decision. Now I was making mine. Pulling into the driveway, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and stared at the house. The house that no longer felt like mine. The lights were still off, just as I had left them, but something felt different. Maybe it wasn't the house that had changed. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the realization that I had been clinging to something that had already slipped away. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps heavy against the pavement as I moved toward the front door. The keys jingled in my grasp, but just as I reached for the lock, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Expecting yet another message from Lillian. Another attempt to justify the unjustifiable. I sighed and pulled it out. But the name on the screen wasn't hers. It was my mother. I hesitated. She was the last person I wanted to talk to right now. Not because I didn't love her, but because she would hear everything in my voice. The exhaustion, the weight of it all, the slow unraveling of everything I had tried to hold together. Still, I answered, "Hey, Mom." There was a brief silence before she spoke, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" I closed my eyes. She already knew. I hadn't told her, but she knew. "No," I admitted quietly. "Not really." Another pause. Then, "Do you want to talk about it?" I wanted to tell her no, to pretend that I was fine, that I had everything under control. But the truth was I didn't, and for once, I didn't have the energy to lie. "She's been unfaithful," I said, the words strange on my tongue. "I saw her. She didn't even try to hide it." A sharp inhale came from the other end of the line. "Oh, Brendan." I sank down onto the front steps, raking a hand through my hair. She says she doesn't want to lose me completely, that she still wants me in her life. A bitter laugh escaped me, like I'm supposed to just stand by while she does whatever she wants. My mother was silent for a long moment before she finally spoke, and what she said caught me off guard. Do you remember that old toy truck you had when you were little? I frowned. What? The red one. You adored that thing. Even when the wheels broke, you kept trying to fix it. You refused to let it go, even though it didn't work anymore. The memory surfaced in my mind. That toy. I had dragged it everywhere, long after it had become nothing more than a shell of what it used to be. She continued, her voice steady. I remember your father sitting you down one day and saying, Brendan, sometimes things break in a way that can't be fixed. And when that happens, holding on only hurts you more. I swallowed hard, my gaze fixed on the cracks in the pavement beneath my feet. She's broken this, honey, my mother said softly, and you can't fix it alone. A sting burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. I know, I whispered, and for the first time I truly did. The house was cold when I stepped inside, but I barely noticed. My body moved on instinct, carrying me through darkened rooms filled with framed memories that suddenly felt like relics from another life. I stopped in the hallway, staring at the wedding photo on the wall. Lillian was beaming, her arms wrapped around me, her eyes filled with something that had long since faded. Slowly, I reached out and ran my fingers over the glass. Then, without a second thought, I lifted the frame from the wall. For a moment, I just held it. Then, I turned it over, removed the back, and slid the picture out. The empty frame felt lighter in my hands. I placed it face down on the console table and walked away. In the bedroom, her side of the closet remained untouched. Dresses, jackets, shoes, all neatly lined up. Proof that she still had a place here, even as she drifted elsewhere. I stood there for a long time. Then I grabbed a box. I didn't throw things. I didn't break anything. I simply started packing. Dress after dress. Shoes. Scarves. Every reminder of her presence in this house. Every piece of her that had once meant everything. By the time I finished, the space felt different. Lighter. Like I could finally breathe again. And then I saw it. A small velvet box, tucked away in the corner. The moment my fingers closed around the small box, a sharp breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I flipped it open, revealing the necklace inside. A delicate silver chain adorned with a sapphire pendant, her birthstone. I had searched tirelessly for weeks to find the perfect piece, something that would speak to how much she still meant to me. It had been an anniversary gift, a token of love and devotion. She had worn it only once. Now, it lay here, forgotten, gathering dust like the remnants of our relationship. My jaw tightened as I snapped the box shut. It was time. The following morning, Lillian returned home. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, when the sound of the front door opening reached my ears. The sharp rhythm of her heels tapping against the hardwood floor grew louder until she stepped into view. She paused when she saw me. Silence stretched between us for a long moment before she exhaled and placed her purse down. Brendan. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Morning. Her expression wavered. She shifted her weight before speaking again. We need to talk. I gestured toward the chair across from me. Go ahead. Hesitation flickered across her face before she sat down. She looked exhausted, her makeup slightly smudged, her hair no longer as neat as usual. I wondered briefly if Adrian had been the one to drop her off. Folding her hands together on the table, she let out a breath. I don't want to fight. Neither do I said evenly. Her eyes searched mine. I know you're hurt. I tilted my head slightly. Do you? She flinched but continued. I made a mistake. I leaned back, waiting. She bit her lip, carefully choosing her next words. I don't want to lose you, Brendan. I know I've hurt you. But, I stopped her with a small shake of my head. Lillian. She hesitated. You already did. A sharp inhale escaped her lips, her hands tightening into themselves. What? I reached for the small box and slid it across the table toward her. The same one that held the necklace she had never cared enough to wear. Her brows furrowed as she looked down at it. "What is this?" "A reminder," I said quietly, "of everything you've let go." Her gaze flickered between the box and me. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but I felt nothing. Not anymore. Rising to my feet, I grabbed my keys. "I packed your things," I said, nodding toward the neatly stacked boxes in the corner. "Take whatever else you need. But after today, I don't want you here again." She blinked. "Brendan." "No," I cut in firmly. "You made your decision. Now I'm making mine." Her hands trembled as she reached for the box. "So, that's it." I met her gaze one last time. "That's it." And then I walked out, leaving her behind. For the first time in years, I felt free. I stepped through that door without looking back, and the weight that had pressed against my chest for so long suddenly lifted. I had spent years holding on to something that had faded long before I ever admitted it. But now? Now I was done. I got into my car and just drove. No destination, no plan, just me, the open road, and the realization that my life wasn't over. It was only beginning. I didn't know how long I drove, but eventually I found myself parked beside a quiet lake just outside of town. The water was still mirroring the golden glow of the morning sun. As I stepped out of the car, the crisp air brushed against my skin, filling my lungs with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. Not the hollow, bitter sound I had become used to, but something real. Because standing there, watching the sunrise, I finally understood I had spent so much time fearing the idea of losing Lillian. The thought of being alone. The belief that without her, my life would unravel. But I wasn't falling apart. I was rebuilding. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Wesley. "Wesley, you okay?" I smiled as I typed back. "Me, better than I've been in years." Because it was true. That night, I packed up the last of Lillian's belongings, changed the locks, and for the first time in forever, I felt like I was taking my life back. No more waiting, no more holding on to something that was never going to return. The weeks that followed weren't easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in, when the silence of the house felt almost unbearable. But every time my mind wandered back to the past, I reminded myself I deserved better. I threw myself into the gym again. Reconnected with old friends. Accepted the promotion at work that I had once been too hesitant to take. I rediscovered the things that brought me joy, things that had nothing to do with Lillian. And then something unexpected happened. One evening, I found myself at a bookstore, lost in the pages of a novel, when a soft voice pulled me from my thoughts. "You have good taste." I looked up. Not Lillian. Someone new. Her name was Sophia. She had warm eyes, a bright smile, and a way of looking at me that didn't make me feel like I was someone's second choice. We started talking, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something I thought had been lost forever. Hope. A few months later, I found myself sitting by that same lake, watching the sunset. Only this time, I wasn't alone. Sophia sat close to me, her fingertips barely grazing mine. She wasn't fully aware of my past, and honestly, she didn't have to be. For the first time, I wasn't weighed down by old memories, I was moving forward. As I sat there, the warmth of her touch grounding me in the present, a realization settled in. Losing Lillian hadn't marked the conclusion of my story. Instead, it had set the stage for something even greater, a new beginning filled with promise.